What is ecstasy really? Like, is it just an intense pleasure or is it something more than that? Welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. You might remember that in the last episode we talked about these experiences reported by the Inuit shaman Ava and Marcel, the main character in Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, these sort of existential ecstasies, I guess you could call them. And today I'd like to look a bit closer at them and see what they might mean, what they might consist in. So you might remember that in the first few episodes, we talked about this state of existential alienation that seems to come with thinking. It seems, in a way, part and parcel of what it is to be human, and how it can come with this existential despair for a number of reasons. Well, they're all really rooted in, I think, in this act of abstraction, which is sort of at the core of thinking. It's sort of really what thinking is. And we talked about how that really always means kind of taking things out of their contexts. That's what we have to do to make something an object of thought. We sort of have to make it fixed. And the thing is that in this act of abstraction, a sort of divide is always going to open up between me, my mind, the thinking subject, and the world. The thinking is sort of like an instrument that the mind uses. It's also kind of a sort of medium that comes in between the mind and the world, between the self and the world, you could say. And of course, it's nice. We're able to predict things and manipulate the world this way, and it's helped us survive. But there does seem to be, or one wonders if there's a price in the form of a loss of this immediate experience of reality, where there's no sense of separation between self and other, and it seems part of human being is having this suspicion that may not be entirely conscious, that something's being lost in translation in a way, that that which hasn't been thought out by us has just been simply lost, and the sense that maybe there's an abyss that opens up a gap between our thoughts and reality. And of course, another important thing about thinking is that it gives us this sort of godlike perspective on the world that is noted in the book of Genesis. We're able to judge the world. We're able to say this is good and that's bad. And actually, I think no matter how enlightened we might think ourselves to be, or however much we think, however influential we may think moral relativism to be, I think judgment about good and evil is really sort of hardwired in us, actually, in our emotions. I think every time we love or hate someone, there's at least a semi-conscious judgment that of this person's virtue or vice, that this person's goodness or evil, even though we might not really think of ourselves as thinking in terms of evil, but there's a kind of, I think even irritation involves a certain moral repugnance. But of course, again, the sort of a downside of this is that the self is also one of our many objects of thought, and it can also, both the self and the world, can also be judged by us to be evil. And I think this can sort of lead us, both of these judgments can lead us to a uniquely human kind of hell that Eckhart Tolle shared. Eckhart Tolle shared one of his with us in the episode before last. But there's also, of course, this very different kind of human experience, this sense that we're able to perceive the world and ourselves in some way that is outside or beyond our thoughts, that we can attain a kind of mental unity with the world or ourselves, even without our actually thinking about them. Um, there are sort of everyday examples of this, I think, in our intuitions and hunches and in our general sense of awareness, our sense of being in the world and our sense of being in it at a particular time and place. But like this existential despair, I think there are also times when this sense of oneness with the world, of a sort of immediate relation with it, or immediate perception of it, seems to sort of break out into these moments of intense hope or joy. And we talked a little bit about those sketches of these experiences with Ava and Marcel. But I want to talk in this episode a little bit more detail about that, and how these ecstatic moments seem really to be, I think, the logical opposite of those moments of existential alienation and despair, because these moments that we saw of existential despair were rooted in a sense of radical, fundamental otherness. The mind from the natural side of the self, or the you could say irrational side of the self. There's another side to the self that can seem simply other, and also the world as a whole can seem simply other. But in these ecstatic moments, there's a sense of their fundamental unity. So we see, for example, with a shaman, Ava talks about these new powers of perception, a new kind of seeing and a new kind of hearing, that these seem to be metaphors of a way of cognition that doesn't involve abstraction, that's immediate. And he also talks about the shining of this new light, which is also, it suggests to me a kind of transparency, that the cosmos seems in some way transparent to him. And he also experiences a oneness with the world, because he talks about having as helpers these spirits of earth and sky and sea. And so for the Inuit people, these are the principles of the world, so the hidden causes of things. And so it's almost as though he's in a direct relationship with the hidden causes or essences of things. And along with the sense that he's able to perceive the world in that immediate way, there comes this sense of deep joy. And so it's sort of similar with Marcel in Proust's work. He talks about Proust's great preoccupation in Search of Lost Time is a sense of alienation from one's past in particular. But I think to me, that just seems a particularly interesting way of talking about being alienated from the world and oneself, because one's past is one's entire record of both the world and of oneself. And so he talks in the first part of his work about this childhood in Combray, this fictional community in rural France that I always want to use this word blessed. It seems that this child is given so much in terms of love and the goodness of life. But yet, the strange thing is, as an adult looking back on his childhood, he can only dredge up these specific details, these specific episodes and times. And he has a sense that as long as he's only able to reach back to consciously and by an effort of his mind, reach back and extract things, he's not really getting anything of that experience. So it's as though that blessedness always seems to elude him, because it's somehow not accessible to his abstractive thought. And I'll quote a passage for you. I must own that I could have assured any questioner that Combray did include other scenes and did exist at other hours than these ones that he's just talked about. But since the facts which I should then have recalled would have been prompted only by an exercise of will, by my intellectual memory, and since the pictures which that kind of memory shows us of the past preserve nothing of the past itself, I should never had any wish to ponder over this residue of Combray. To me, it was in reality all dead. And a bit later he writes of our past, it is a labor in vain to attempt to recapture it. All the efforts of our intellect must prove futile. The past is hidden somewhere outside the realm, beyond the reach of intellect. So I think Proust really is talking about, he's talking about existential alienation here, a sense of this idea that we can pick out specific details of the world around us or attributes of ourselves, but unless they come up to us in an immediate way, in their wholeness, that it's as though they're not really of any value to us as a source. They're no real source of joy or hope or fundamental hope to us. But similar to Ava, there's what seems to be an almost spontaneous moment in which this is reversed. The sense of hopelessness is reversed, and he's able to perceive reality in a way that somehow almost miraculously seems just direct or immediate. It's as though he's a secular shaman in a way in this scene. He talks about this sense of boundaries suddenly coming down to the point where even the ultimate boundary, death, seems in a way illusory. He talks about ceasing to feel mortal. And with this sense of being able to perceive the world in an immediate way comes to Marcel a joyful sense of unity, seeming not just in touch with his own past, but with the world as a whole. And this, of course, happened to the main character after he tasted this Madeleine cake dipped in tea. And I think I mentioned that earlier as sort of a random thing. But everything isn't quite as random as it may seem. In earlier drafts, it seems Proust, the thing that the character was eating was a piece of toast. And I think it's quite interesting that he revised this and he put a Madeleine in its place, because I think this little cake it's a rich cake, and it's also rich in symbolism. So it's a very tasty thing for people who are looking for signs and symbols. I think really what Proust is trying to say is his characters come across this new unity of body and soul. At one point, he refers to the Madeleine as, quote, richly sensual under its severe religious folds. And actually, I just happen to have a Madeleine with me, and I want to show it to you. This is what one looks like. Always a trick to not reverse yourself. So you can see there are creases in it that to Proust must have suggested the vestments of a priest. But to anybody who has had one of these little things, there's nothing ascetic about the experience of tasting one. It's sweet and it's buttery. It's like a miniature pound cake, except with this golden crusty goodness around the edges. And as Proust also tells us, it has a curious shape, right? He says it's shaped like a scallop shell, which it is sort of like an elongated scallop shell, right? Which is interesting too, because the scallop shell is a symbol for people who pilgrims on the Camino, the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. But it was also an emblem of the goddess Aphrodite, the scallop shell. If any of you know the famous painting Birth of Venus by Botticelli, she's the goddess, the nude goddess is standing on top of this massive scallop shell. So it's an interesting juxtaposition of elements, right? Um, so the point that I'm trying to make here is that based on these two anecdotes, anyway, it seems these existential ecstasies that humans have sometimes seem to have to do with an intimate and really immediate knowledge, both of the world and of ourselves, and a sense that this sense of alienation is somehow being overturned or reversed. And in the next episode or two, I'd like to delve a bit deeper into this, both into the subjective experience, but also how it's been looked at by science. Science, I think, has tried recently to try to get some grasp of what might be going on here in objective terms. And I think this kind of inquiry leads us into some very interesting and potentially life-changing directions. So on that note, thanks again for joining me, and hope to see you next time.